Anyone still alive in there?
In a blizzard, and a miracle.
Don't come closer, I have a knife!
Changed her life
Just
forever.
need shelter, ma'am.
Before we begin,
A woman once froze to death because of me.
out here in the frozen silence
Then
of the
maybe this
frontier,
time,
a woman
you'll save
fought
one.
to stay alive while the storm swallowed the world.
You don't owe
away.
me anything.
And when hope was nearly gone, a stranger
You reminded
appeared
me
on
I
Mountain
still
Lake,
can.
with eyes like winter. and
They
hands
froze
made
2
for
miles
life.
from help.
He gave her fire, then a roof, then something.
You don't
far
have to be
rarer,
alone anymore.
peace. But in the Wild West,
Looking for Samuel
peace
Reed.
never lasts. As the sun rose over a cabin
You found him.
from mercy,
I'm done
the law
running.
came riding through
If
the
there's a way
snow,
back, I'll
love
find
stood
it.
against judgment. This
I'll
is
be
the
here,
story of Elijah
telling your
Cole
truth.
and Samuel Reed, two souls who found warmth in a world of ice and built a home the storm could never take. Before we begin, take a moment to comment the name of your city. Where are you watching from tonight? And when the story ends, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Montana winter of 1874. The fiercest blizzard in years swept through the Madison Range. The wind howled like lost spirits tearing through the pines heavy with ice. Amid the endless white, a wagon lay overturned, its wheel shattered. The horse collapsed in silence. Inside, Clara Jameson, a young widow, clutched a fading oil lamp. The trembling flame lit her pale face, lips turning blue from cold and fear. She whispered between ragged breaths, "Dear God, please don't let me die here." The wind answered only with a hollow silence, until through the swirling snow a figure appeared. Tall, wrapped in worn leather, his face shadowed beneath a snow-covered hat. Each step he took was heavy, like he was walking through memories. Ethan Cole, a solitary mountain man, knelt beside the broken wagon. The dim light flickered in his eyes, cold as frost, yet burning faintly with warmth. He lifted Clara into his arms and carried her to a small wooden cabin deep in the forest. As the fire crackled, she awoke trembling and saw him dividing his last piece of bread in half. "Why did you help me?" she whispered. Ethan stared into the flames, his voice low and rough. "Because once I couldn't save the one I loved." Outside, the storm still roared, but inside that cabin a different fire began to burn, quiet, tender, and bound by fate. Part 1. The Shelter. The fire cracked softly in the hearth, its faint orange glow dancing over the rough wooden walls of the small cabin. Outside, the wind howled through the pine ridge like the wounded cry of a beast. Snow fell thick and heavy, blanketing the roof as if trying to swallow the whole world beyond. Yet inside, a fragile warmth still fought against the brutal cold of the mountain night. On the narrow pine bed, Clara Jameson lay curled beneath a thick quilt. Her skin was pale, her lips tinged blue, her breath so thin it seemed ready to break. Ethan Cole sat beside her, his rough hand touching her forehead cold as ice. He shook his head slightly, and in his eyes flickered an old fear. Not of the storm outside, but of a memory buried deep for years. He quickly added more wood to the fire, poured hot water from the kettle, and mixed in a handful of dried herbs, the kind he used every winter to fight the cold. Lifting her head gently, he let a few drops touch her lips. Clara moaned faintly, her eyelids trembling as if lost in a fever dream. "Drink, girl. Don't give up." Ethan whispered, his voice low and rough, the voice of a man who had spoken more to wind and mountains than to people. He sat in silence, watching the firelight, listening to the storm outside blend with her fragile breathing. It had been so long since he'd felt this, the presence of another soul in his lonely world. He pulled the blanket higher to cover her shoulders, then put on his worn leather coat. He was about to lie down on the floor, but before moving away, his gaze lingered on her face. Pale skin, tangled brown hair, and small hands gripping the quilt, as if afraid the fragile warmth would vanish. Ethan lowered his head and murmured almost to himself, "It's been a long time since I heard another person's breath." He didn't know why he said it. Maybe because for 7 years this cabin had known only the sound of windfire and sometimes his own voice speaking to ghosts of the past. Now, the faint rhythm of her breathing made the room feel alive again. He moved quietly to the corner of the room, sitting down on an old wooden chair. The firelight flickered across his face, strong-weathered, yet deeply tired. The faint scars on his wrists and cheek told stories he had never spoken aloud. Outside, the snow was still thick, but the storm had softened. The wind no longer screamed, only the steady drip of melting ice from the roof broke the silence. Time moved slowly, almost frozen. Clara dreamed. In her dream, she saw Thomas, her husband, the man who died in a mining collapse 2 years before. He smiled, reaching a hand toward her, but then the wind rose and his face dissolved into snow. Clara woke with a gasp, cold sweat on her skin. Above her, the ceiling was gray timber. Firelight flickered faintly against the walls. No sound of horses, no wagon wheels, only silence and warmth. She sat up, trembling confusion and fear in her eyes. And then she saw him, the man from the blizzard. Ethan looked up at the noise. Their eyes met hers, wide with alarm, his calm but guarded. He rose slowly, hands raised slightly as if to show he meant no harm. "You're awake. Don't be afraid. You're safe." His voice was deep, slow, like stones rolling in a dry creek. Clara backed up her spine, pressing against the wall. "Who are you? Why am I here?" Ethan set the kettle down on the table, keeping his distance. "Name's Ethan Cole. Found you in a wagon overturned in the valley. You were near dead from the cold. I just did what needed doing." She looked around the small, rough cabin, but warm. On the table, half a loaf of bread, a few logs burning in the hearth, and his thick coat draped over her shoulders. A shiver ran down her spine, not of fear, but of realization. Kindness still existed, even in a place this cruel. Her voice softened. "You saved me." Ethan didn't answer right away. He only nodded, then turned back to the fire, adding another log. "No need for thanks. I just didn't want to bury another body in the morning." The words sounded cold, but his tone wasn't. There was pain behind them, the kind of pain of a man who had done that far too many times before. They fell silent. Only the crackle of fire and the whisper of wind through the cracks filled the air. Clara clutched the blanket closer, eyes following him. In the glow, she could see his face clearly, deep eyes, unshaven beard features carved hard by years of solitude. He wasn't handsome by any city's measure, but there was a ruggedness about him, like a mountain shaped by snow and time still standing firm. After a long pause, Ethan spoke without looking at her. "You should rest more. When morning comes, if you're strong enough, I'll help fix your wagon." Clara said nothing, just watched the fire. She knew that without this man, she would have frozen to death in the dark. Fear slowly gave way to gratitude and then to something else fragile, uncertain, a small spark of trust. "My name is Clara. Clara Jameson," she said softly. Ethan looked up, a faint, warm light in his eyes. "Pleased to meet you, Mrs. Jameson. Call me Clara. I have no one left to call me Mrs. anymore." Silence. Ethan understood and said nothing more. He only turned his face away so she wouldn't see the shadow of sorrow in his eyes. Clara lay back down, eyes slowly closing. She listened to the soft crackle of fire, the quiet wind, and the steady breathing of the stranger watching over her. In that brief moment before sleep, she realized something. The man she had feared was the only one keeping her alive in this frozen world. Outside, the snow had stopped. From the roof, the first drop of melted ice fell to the ground, silent, yet signaling the start of something new. In that small cabin deep in the Montana woods, two lonely souls, one fleeing his past, the other, her pain, had unknowingly found each other. And on that bitter winter night, the warmth of one human being became the simplest kind of miracle. Part 2. The cabin begins. The first dawn after the snowstorm came to the mountains like a miracle. The heavy gray clouds slowly drifted away, revealing a clear sky and a pale sun, fragile like a child just waking from a long sleep. Golden light slipped through the frost-laden pines, melting the thick snow that had buried the roof through the night. Steam rose gently from the ground, and the morning air carried the scent of wood, melting snow, and life returning once more. Ethan Cole had been awake for hours. He wasn't a man who slept long, especially not with a stranger in a cabin that had known only wind and fire for years. Standing at the doorway, he drew in a deep breath, then picked up his axe and walked down the slope. The ground was slick and damp, but his steps were sure. Each swing of his axe struck sharply, echoing through the quiet valley, like the steady heartbeat of the morning. Inside the cabin, Clara Jameson stirred awake. She wasn't used to mountain mornings so pure, yet so biting. Sunlight crept through the small window, painting a golden line across the wooden floor. She sat up, fingers brushing the thick blanket that still held warmth. Fragments of memory rushed back: the storm's roar, the man by the fire, the rough voice that had whispered, "Because once I failed to save the one I loved." She rose and stepped outside. The sight before her made her stop. In the clearing, Ethan stood, his coat darkened with sweat. He was striking at a pine trunk, breath rising in white clouds. Every blow was clean, rhythmic, not the motion of a wild man, but of one who had been trained, disciplined. She approached quietly, her boots sinking into the snow. Ethan paused and lifted his gaze. Morning light filtered through the mist, glinting in his deep, stern eyes. "What are you doing?" Clara asked softly, hesitantly. Ethan wiped his forehead and set the axe down. "Building a house." A house, she blinked, surprised. Here he nodded, his voice low and steady, like the earth itself. "For you. The wagon's beyond repair. Last night's storm was a warning. If another comes, this cabin won't hold. You need somewhere safe." Clara fell silent. In a world where most men looked away from suffering, the words "build you a house" felt almost unreal. She studied him, the broad shoulders, the calm certainty in his voice, and realized he spoke not out of obligation, but as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Not charity, duty. A faint smile touched her lips, the first in years. "You don't have to do that." "I know." Ethan lifted the axe again. "But I want to." The light of dawn caught in her brown hair, turning it gold like honey. For a moment, Ethan froze. Something in that smile, gentle, unguarded, tightened his chest. How long had it been since he'd seen someone smile like that? Maybe since before the mountains took everything from him. He turned away, masking the stir of emotion. "If you're feeling strong enough, I'll show you how to pick the right trees. Only solid wood makes a lasting wall." Clara nodded, gripping the sleeve of his coat still draped over her shoulders. "I'll help." They worked together. Ethan's voice was steady, instructive, explaining how to read the grain, how to stake the corners. Clara's hands trembled at first, but she followed carefully. Each swing of his axe, each step she took began to form a quiet rhythm, two lives finding balance in the wilderness. By noon, the sun hung high. Meltwater trickled through the clearing. They had raised the first frame of the cabin. Clara leaned against a post, breathless, cheeks flushed pink with cold and effort. Ethan planted a beam, inspecting the height. "If the weather holds, it'll take only a few days," he said. "A few days," she laughed softly. "I didn't think I'd survive one more night." He looked at her, his expression softening. "You did, Clara. That's enough." For a long moment, silence fell, sacred and still. The wind paused, and it seemed the whole mountain held its breath. Then, without warning, a gust roared down the slope. Ethan turned just in time to see one of the main beams sway. "Move!" he shouted. Before Clara could react, the heavy post gave way, crashing toward her. Ethan lunged, grabbing her arm and pulling her aside. They fell hard into the snow, the beam striking the ground inches away with a dull, thunderous crack. Ethan hovered above her, his hands gripping her shoulders, breath rough and hot against her cheek. For an instant, the world disappeared, only their heartbeats and their eyes. She looked up into those deep, storm-colored eyes, framed by hair tousled by wind and snow. He looked down at her parted lips, her pale face, and the shimmer of fear, and something else beneath her gaze. Neither spoke. The silence between them was heavy, alive, carrying 1,000 words that neither dared say aloud. Finally, Ethan pushed himself up, voice low and hoarse. "I'm sorry." "I didn't mean." Clara sat up, brushing snow from her skirt, a faint smile curving her lips. "It's all right. You just saved me again." Ethan froze, then laughed, the first sound of laughter she'd heard from him. It was short, rough, like dry wood cracking in a fire. But in that laugh, something melted. By evening, they were back at work, lifting the fallen beam together. The sun dipped low, painting the forest in honeyed gold. Clara looked up at the rough roof frame taking shape above them. "What do you call it?" she asked. Ethan paused, following her gaze. "A home." "Whose home?" She smiled. He hesitated a moment, then said quietly, "Yours, and maybe mine too." The wind swept through the pines, carrying the scent of sap and smoke. In that soft, glowing light, a man who had forgotten how to believe and a woman who had stopped hoping began, without knowing it, to build the one thing they both needed most in the wilderness, a new beginning. Part 3. Firelight. Confession. Night descended softly over the Montana range. After days of building the cabin, even the forest seemed to exhale warmth. The wind had gone still, the snow had stopped falling. Only the firelight flickered against the wooden walls, painting them with trembling bands of amber and red, the breathing pulse of the earth itself. Inside the small cabin, Ethan Cole sat by the hearth, eyes fixed on the flames. His face glowed in the fire's orange hue, warm yet shadowed by something dark and unspeakable. His calloused, cracked hands still gripped a small carving knife, the same one he had carried since leaving the army. Clara Jameson sat across from him on a low stool wrapped in a blanket, a steaming cup of herbal tea in her hands. She watched him quietly, this reserved man who spoke little and kept a wall between himself and the world. Since the night he saved her, she had sensed there was something different about him, a silence not born of indifference, but of loss. The fire crackled softly. Clara broke the quiet with a whisper, afraid to disturb the stillness. "I've never seen anyone work as hard as you. You never stop." Ethan didn't answer right away. He gave a small, weary smile. "When your hands are busy, your heart doesn't have time to think. I work to forget." "Forget what?" she asked, eyes on the fire. He was silent for a long time. The light flickered in his eyes, and in that moment she saw not just reflection, but the shadow of a memory still burning. Ethan set the knife down. His fingers trembled slightly, joints stiff with tension. 7 years ago, I had a wife and a little girl." His voice sank lower, each word falling like a stone. "We lived on the far side of the Madison Range. One winter night, a storm came faster than anyone expected. I was out hunting. When I got back, there were only footprints in the snow, and they ended at the river." Clara held her breath. Her lips quivered. He continued, voice rough and breaking. "I found them the next morning, not even 2 miles from home. My wife was holding our daughter, shielding her from the wind. Both of them were already cold." The fire popped in the hearth, casting light across the faint scars on his cheek, fractures in the surface of a soul that had been broken too long. Ethan bowed his head, his voice a rasp. "I dug their graves with my bare hands, couldn't even fetch a shovel. The snow was too thick. I buried them where I found them, and I swore I'd never leave this mountain again." The cabin fell silent. The wind had stopped outside. The only sound was the slow, steady beating of hearts mingled with the soft crackle of flame. Clara gripped her cup tightly, eyes glistening. She looked at his broad shoulders, now seeming fragile, human. She understood then, beneath his hard and distant shell, was a man whose heart had already been shattered once. Without a word, she set the cup down and reached out. Her small, trembling hand rested atop his rough one, the first touch he'd felt from another soul in years. Ethan startled slightly, his eyes flickering with confusion, as if he'd forgotten what human warmth felt like. But this time he didn't pull away. The firelight glowed over their faces. Her hand lay in his, and between them a quiet warmth began to spread, real fragile, alive. Clara spoke softly, her voice trembling. "You shouldn't have to bear that alone." Ethan looked at her. His eyes shone wet in the firelight. He inhaled deeply, exhaled slow. "I should have died instead." His voice cracked raw with guilt. "If I'd come back sooner. If I hadn't gone after that deer." Clara shook her head, tears sliding down her cheek. "No, Ethan. You lived, so you could save someone else." The words fell between them, gentle but powerful, like a prayer. Their eyes met. In that gaze lived pain and understanding and a fragile spark of belief. He stared at her for a long time, lips pressed tight, then nodded slightly. as if he'd just found a reason to keep living. "You talk like you know me," Ethan murmured, his voice a low rumble. "I don't know who you were," Clara replied steadily, "but I know who you are. Bad men don't grieve, and they never dare to remember." Ethan froze. The firelight shimmered in his eyes, but for the first time it wasn't just flame. It was hope. He looked down at her hand still resting in his and whispered, "Thank you, Clara." She smiled faintly, a tear catching the light. "No, thank you for telling me." Outside, the moon broke through the clouds, silver light spilling across snow-covered pines. The window rattled softly under a gentle breeze. Inside the small cabin, the fire burned brighter, casting two shadows side by side, one of a man who had lost everything and one of a woman who had just been saved. They were no longer alone. Between darkness and flame, two frozen hearts had begun to thaw. Ethan glanced up at the rough wooden roof they'd built that morning and murmured almost to himself, "Maybe this fire isn't just for warmth." Clara nodded, her eyes still on the dancing flames. "No, Ethan, it's to keep us alive." The fire crackled softly, light flickering like breath. Outside, snow began to fall again, but gently this time, like forgiveness descending from the sky. And in that quiet night, his confession by firelight became more than the telling of an old sorrow. It became the first spark of something new, trust and the rebirth of a human heart. Part 4. The Stranger's Kindness. That morning, the Montana sky finally wore a rare shade of sunlight. Thin clouds drifted past the tall pines, and the snow on the cabin roof melted into slow, dripping beads that fell softly onto the wooden porch. Winter was still there, but its bite had softened, leaving behind the scent of pine resin and damp soil, the smell of life returning. Clara Jameson woke early and pushed open the cabin door. She breathed in deeply the cold air, so pure it seemed to open her chest. For the first time since her husband's death, she didn't feel swallowed by loneliness. Behind the cabin, Ethan Cole was chopping wood. The rhythmic thud of his axe echoed through the morning stillness, steady, precise, like the heartbeat of the wilderness. "Do you ever rest?" Clara asked with a small laugh, folding her arms. Ethan turned, eyes steady, but lips curling in the faintest smile. "If I stop, the wind takes all the warmth from the house. And if I make you a cup of real coffee, will you stop then?" He paused, surprised, then chuckled, a sound brief and quiet, like sunlight flickering through clouds. "Coffee? I usually just toss the grounds into hot water and swallow before it goes cold." Clara laughed outright. "Then today, I'll teach you how to make coffee properly, real coffee, not whatever soldiers pretend to drink." Ethan arched a brow. "And I'll teach you how to start a fire that doesn't die halfway through." And so a small bargain was struck, a shared lesson between two lonely souls. Clara filled a pot with water and gathered the last handful of beans she had left, the only keepsake from her half-finished supply wagon. She crushed them in a wooden mortar, releasing a warm aroma that wrapped around the small room. Ethan stood quietly nearby, watching as though afraid to disturb the moment. "You know," Clara said as she stirred, "in my town, the smell of coffee in the morning meant a home was still alive. They used to say if a house smells of coffee, there's still hope inside." Ethan nodded slightly, voice low. "Out here, burning wood is my kind of hope." Clara smiled, poured the coffee into 2 small mugs, and slid one toward him. Steam rose between them, softening their faces in the glow. Ethan took a cautious sip. The bitterness spread on his tongue, but underneath it lingered a faint sweetness. He frowned. "It's bitter." "Bitterness is what makes it stay with you," Clara replied gently. He set the cup down, watching the swirl of steam fade upward. In that dim light, his eyes seemed far away, lost in some place she couldn't see. She realized then he had never truly allowed himself rest from his ghosts. A moment later, he stood walking to the door. "Your turn. Come on." She followed him outside. In the clearing, he'd already set up a small pile of kindling. "Ever start a fire before?" he asked. "Only in a kitchen stove, with matches. You don't always get matches here." He picked up 2 flint stones and struck them together. Sparks leapt, falling onto dry moss. "You have to talk to fire," he said quietly. "It doesn't like impatience." Clara crouched beside him, watching every move. He handed her the flint and his knife. "Try it. Easy now. Don't be afraid." Her hands trembled as she tried. Sparks flashed but died. She bit her lip, tried again, and this time one caught. Smoke curled up thin and white. Ethan leaned down, blowing gently until a tiny flame flickered to life. They both watched it grow. The light danced over their faces. Clara smiled, a bright, almost childlike joy, the wonder of someone rediscovering something simple yet magical. "Now I see why you called it hope," she whispered. Ethan nodded. "Hope, if you tend it long enough, will keep you alive through the coldest night." She fell silent. The wind sighed through the pines. Melted snow trickled softly from the roof. They sat together, not needing to speak, just listening to the fire crackle, and their breaths blending with the quiet. Clara glanced at him. The breeze caught her hair, sending a few loose strands brushing against his face. Ethan froze, eyes softening. He poured her another cup and handed it over. "Careful. It's still hot." Their fingers brushed a fleeting touch, and her heart skipped. She took a sip. The warmth and taste of coffee spread through her chest. For the first time, she said softly, "I think I know what happiness smells like." "Happiness?" he asked, almost shy. "Yes," she smiled. "It's not expensive, not rare. It's just something that makes you feel alive." He went quiet. Something stirred inside him, a warmth both tender and terrifying. For years he'd been a shell of a man living only to atone. But now, because of a smile and a cup of coffee, he felt something awaken, a desire to live again. He turned away, pretending to busy himself with the firewood. "You talk too much. Drink before it gets cold." Clara laughed, knowing he was hiding. Ethan wasn't good with emotions. Silence had always been his armor. Yet when he glanced at her through the firelight, a faint smile crossed his lips, fleeting, fragile. And right behind that smile was fear. Fear that if his heart beat again, it might break once more. He stood murmuring, "I'll fetch more wood from the ridge. You should rest." She watched his silhouette disappear among the pines, steady, solitary. The breeze brushed her hair, and the taste of coffee lingered on her lips. Inside the fire still burned the scent of coffee mingling with wood smoke. Clara sat quietly, eyes on the door. She knew something was forming between them, delicate as the flame they'd just kindled, fragile but strong enough to warm an endless winter. By dusk, Ethan returned. The sun's last rays glowed gold across the slope. Clara had fallen asleep at the table, her hair spilling across her face. Gently, he pulled a blanket over her shoulders. The firelight shimmered on both their faces, warm, soft, peaceful. He sat down, studying her in silence. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a ghost wandering the wild. He felt home, but fear crept in. Every beautiful thing in his life had been carried away by storms. He feared this too might vanish like steam from a cup of coffee fading into the cold air. He lowered his head and whispered as if to the fire itself, "Don't make me believe, only to lose again." The fire answered with a soft crackle, gentle as breath. Outside, the snow had stopped. The sky was clearer than it had been in months. And inside that small Montana cabin, the kindness of a stranger was quietly becoming something far greater, faith, life, and the slow, trembling beginning of love. Part 5. A Past That Hunts. The morning sky was heavy and gray, the color of cold iron. Wind swept up from the valley, carrying the sharp, damp breath of coming snow. The air felt still, too still, a silence that pressed against the world like a warning. Ethan Cole was at the edge of the woods, splitting logs as he did every morning. Clara Jameson was hanging blankets on the porch rail, humming softly to herself. Everything seemed ordinary until the sound of hoofbeats echoed through the frozen stillness, steady, powerful, drawing closer. Ethan froze mid-swing. His hand tightened on the axe handle, his expression hardening. Strangers rarely came this far into the mountains, and when they did, it was never for good news. He set the axe down slowly and stepped out from the tree line, his eyes narrowing toward the snow-covered trail. Out of the white distance came a rider, a man cloaked in dust-stained leather, a revolver at his hip, and a glint of silver on his hat. He reined his horse to a stop before the cabin, his eyes sweeping over the scene. "Morning," the man rasped. "This the place of one Ethan Cole." Ethan didn't answer right away. His gaze was calm but guarded. Then he gave a small nod. "I'm Cole. What's this about?" The rider pulled a crumpled paper from his coat and tossed it onto the ground. It landed face up in the snow, the ink still legible despite the tears and stains wanted. Ethan Cole, former federal cavalryman, charged with desertion and the murder of a superior officer, considered armed and dangerous. Clara stood frozen. The wind bit her cheeks, but she didn't feel it. Her eyes dropped to the poster, then back to Ethan. The man who had saved her, built her a home, shared his fire. He didn't flinch. Only his eyes lowered slightly, like someone accepting the return of a ghost. "I was told to deliver it," the rider said curtly. "They've had this posted in the southern towns for 7 years. Folks figured you were dead. Maybe they were wrong." Ethan's voice was even. "I'm not the man they're looking for anymore. You've done your duty, thank you." The man stared at him for a long moment, then nodded, tugged the reins, and rode off. The sound of his horse faded into the forest until only silence remained. The paper still fluttered at Clara's feet. She bent down, picked it up, and stared at the words as if they might change. Then she lifted her eyes to him. "Is it true, Ethan?" His answer was quiet, unhesitant. Yes. Just one word, no denial, no excuse, but it carried a weight that made her fingers tighten around the paper. "You killed a man." He met her gaze. There was no anger, no pleading, only the weary calm of a man who had carried too much for too long. "I only protected someone who was innocent." The words hung in the cold air like smoke that wouldn't fade. Clara said nothing. Ethan sat on the porch step, his hands clenched white. "He was my captain," Ethan said, finally, voice low. "Captain Morton. He wanted to execute a woman, Lydia, a housemaid accused of stealing, but she hadn't stolen anything. I begged him to spare her. He laughed and said, 'In this country, poor women don't get justice.'" Ethan's hand trembled slightly. He raised his gun to kill her. "I didn't think. I drew first. One shot. He fell. And I ran. Since that day, I've been hunted." He lifted his head, eyes meeting hers. 7 years, Clara. 7 years I haven't killed, haven't stolen, haven't left these mountains. But still they call me a criminal." Clara sat down across from him, her eyes shimmering. "And you've never told anyone?" He shook his head slowly. "No one listens to a deserter." "I stayed silent because sometimes truth saves no one." She looked at him, really looked, and saw not a fugitive, but the same man who had rescued her from the storm, built her shelter, and handed her a cup of coffee each morning. Yet that same man now sat before her, haunted by shame and fear. A gust of wind tore the poster from her hand. Ethan moved as if to catch it, but Clara stepped forward first. She let the paper fall and watched the wind carry it away across the snow. "They can believe whatever they want," she said softly, her voice trembling but steady. "But I'll believe what I've seen." Ethan's eyes flickered, a fragile light rising behind the darkness. "And what is it you see in me, Clara?" She answered slowly, each word deliberate. "I see a man with a heavy past, but no evil left in his heart. A man who saved my life, and doesn't need anyone else to prove his worth." Her words fell like warm air across the frozen space between them. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment as if to memorize them. Then he spoke again, his voice breaking. "You don't understand, Clara. A man like me doesn't deserve trust. I've shed blood, and being near me puts you in danger. I've lived in fear." "Ethan," she interrupted, her gaze clear and fierce. "Fear of loneliness, fear of losing everything, fear of the world's coldness. But do you know the worst kind of cold? It's not outside. It's when you stop believing in people. And I choose to believe in you." Ethan stood motionless. Inside his chest, something cracked, not in pain but release. He took a deep breath, the icy air burning in his lungs, yet it felt cleaner than it had in years. "I don't deserve that kind of faith," he murmured. "No one does," Clara said with a faint smile. "We just try not to betray it." They stood in silence, surrounded by snow. The wind was still cold, but a different warmth began to stir between them, small and visible, alive. Ethan bowed his head. "Thank you for not walking away. I've been running long enough," Clara whispered. "This time I'm staying." The sun sank behind the ridge, leaving streaks of pale gold over the snow. They went inside where the fire still burned. Outside, the wanted poster drifted farther and farther away, disappearing into the white like a past finally ready to be buried. Later that night, Ethan sat by the hearth, staring at the flames dancing across his scarred hands. Clara's image lingered in the glow, kind, steady, and brave enough to believe in a broken man. He spoke softly, almost to himself. "Maybe God sent you so I could be forgiven not by him, but by another soul." Somewhere in the valley, the wind howled again, but this time it didn't sound like a threat. It was simply the echo of the past fading away, making room for something new: faith, compassion, and a love quietly awakening between two people who thought they'd lost everything. Part 6. The promise of spring-winter was slowly retreating from the Montana mountains like an old beast exhausted after a long sleep. The snow melted, revealing dark soil and tender green shoots pushing through under the newborn sunlight. The air had changed warmer, softer, filled with the scent of renewal. The cabin that Ethan Cole and Clara Jameson had been building for weeks was nearly complete. The pine walls gave off a faint, resin-sweet scent, the roof was sealed, and the first window pane had been fitted. When light streamed through the glass, it flooded the room with a golden hue, gentle and honey-warm wrapping, two lonely souls in something that almost felt like peace. That morning, Clara sat on the porch mending Ethan's old coat. Each stitch moved slowly, deliberately. From somewhere behind the trees came the sound of his axe, steady and sure, a rhythm she'd grown to find comforting. Ethan was finishing the porch frame. The sun glinted on his shoulders, his brow damp with sweat, but there was a faint smile on his lips as he paused to listen to birdsong. His strikes no longer carried the weight of penance. They were measured lighter, the sound of a man building, not escaping. Clara set her needle down and walked over. "You know," she said playfully, "I never thought I'd live to see this spring." Ethan smiled without looking up. "I never thought I'd live long enough to have someone say that to me." They both laughed, the kind of laugh that comes from somewhere deep where silence used to live. It rose softly into the mountain air and drifted away among the pines. By noon, they were in the clearing, planting the first seeds around the cabin. Ethan dug the earth while Clara gently dropped grains of barley into the soil, covering them with her hands. The scent of damp dirt mingled with the resin of the wooden beams, the smell of life beginning again. "I can't remember the last time I planted anything," Ethan murmured. "Maybe when my daughter was still alive. She wanted to grow flowers. But the snow came early that year. We never saw them bloom." Clara paused, looking up at him. The grief in his voice had softened with time, not sharp anymore, but weathered into something tender. "Then this year you'll see them bloom," she said firmly. "Not just flowers, a whole home." Ethan met her eyes, then reached out and took her dirt-stained hand gently in his. "You really believe that, Clara?" "I do. Because I'm not afraid anymore." Her words stilled him. He looked at her, a mix of warmth and ache in his gaze. Belief to him was a dangerous thing. Too beautiful, too fragile. That evening, as the light tilted gold across the ridge, Ethan climbed the front beam of the porch. In his hand was his old carving knife, its edge dulled from years of use. Clara watched from below, puzzled. "What are you doing up there?" "Carving a promise," he said simply. The knife bit into the wood with a slow, dry rasp. Each stroke was careful, reverent. When he was done, he stepped back. The sun hit the letters just right, revealing the single word he'd carved, rough but steady: home. Just 4 letters, but they carried 7 years of solitude and silent repentance. Ethan stood staring at it, his face soft in the golden light. Clara approached, reading the word aloud. She lifted a trembling hand, and touched the grooves, her fingers tracing the fresh pine grain. The scent of resin rose up, and something in her chest tightened. Home, she whispered, voice breaking like spring wind through young leaves. I'd forgotten what that word feels like. Ethan looked at her gently. Now you remember. Tears welled in her eyes as she turned to him. I thought I didn't deserve one anymore, not after losing everything. I was just wandering. But you, her voice trembled. You made me believe I still have a place, that I still deserve to stay. Ethan rested a hand on her shoulder, his smile faint but true. No one loses the right to be happy, Clara. We just have to be brave enough to accept it when it comes. A soft breeze passed through, carrying the scent of pine sap and thawing earth. The sunset spilled across the roof, painting everything gold. Beneath their feet, the seeds they'd planted lay quietly in the soil, waiting to rise. Clara gazed up once more at the word home. Her vision blurred with tears, but she was smiling. This cabin, she whispered. It's not just yours anymore, it's ours. Ethan didn't answer. He didn't need to. The look they shared said everything: companionship, understanding, and the quiet promise of belonging. Night came softly. Inside, the fire burned warm, the scent of new wood mingling with the earth outside. Clara sat at the table writing in the small journal she had carried since leaving town. Her handwriting glowed in the firelight. I have seen spring rise from snow. I have seen sunlight pour through the window of a house newly built. And I have met a man who made no grand vows, only carved one word: home. And somehow that word stopped my heart from wandering. She closed the book and looked up. Ethan was by the fireplace, adjusting the new window frame, his face steady and calm in the glow. Outside, the spring wind whispered through the forest, rustling the trees like a blessing. The first stars blinked awake above the clearing, and there, beneath the carved beam that read home, two people who had once been lost, two souls who thought they'd run out of second chances, now stood together under one roof. No vows, no grand declarations, just presence. And that, in its quiet simplicity, was their promise of spring. Part 7. The sheriff arrives that morning. Dawn crept in, wrapped in heavy mist. The weak light of the sun was smothered by low, pale gray clouds, bathing the forest in a cold silver haze. Drops of dew fell from pine branches, merging with the soft sigh of wind through the valley. Ethan Cole rose early. He rekindled the fire in the hearth and brewed 2 cups of coffee, one for himself, one for Clara Jameson, who was still asleep on the chair by the window. The early light caught her hair, making it shimmer like honey. For a moment he just watched her, a small, quiet smile flickering across his face. Then it came. The sound of hoofbeats, slow, deliberate, and heavy, like the heartbeat of fate itself. Ethan froze, fingers tightening around the mug. He knew that rhythm. It wasn't the gait of a trader or a hunter. It was the march of lawmen, men trained to track, to find, to end. Through the mist, a silhouette emerged. A rider cloaked in brown, a silver revolver glinting at his hip, and on his chest a star-shaped badge gleaming coldly in the dim light. Sheriff Ward. The name struck Ethan's mind like a long-forgotten echo. The sheriff reined his horse before the cabin, his breath fogging in the cold air. "Fine morning, Cole," he said, voice low and steady, the voice of a man who'd seen too many criminals lower their heads. Ethan stepped out onto the porch. The morning wind lifted strands of his hair, tugging at the edge of his coat. "Ward," he answered evenly. "Didn't think you'd remember me after all this time. 7 years isn't long enough to forget the man who rattled an entire regiment." Ward dismounted and pulled a folded, weathered paper from his coat. "I've got a warrant for your arrest, Ethan Cole, murder of a superior officer and desertion." Clara stirred at the sound of voices. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped to the door, eyes still soft with sleep, but now widening in alarm. "Sheriff, what's going on?" Ethan didn't look back at her. His gaze stayed on Ward. "No need to explain, Clara. I know why he's here." Ward's eyes held a flicker of something that wasn't quite anger, perhaps regret. "You can come with me peacefully. I'll see that you get a fair trial." Ethan nodded, once calm as still water. He stepped off the porch, raising his hands without resistance. I'm done running. It's time the past caught up. The morning light broke through the mist, casting pale gold across his face, steady, unflinching. And in that moment, Clara understood the man before her wasn't a fugitive anymore. He was someone who had finally found peace with who he was. Ward approached the handcuffs gleaming like frozen steel. But before he could reach Ethan, Clara cried out, "No, don't. Take him." She ran forward, tears already filling her eyes. "He's not a criminal, he saved my life." The sheriff stopped, startled. Clara stood between them, arms spread wide, trembling but unyielding. "If not for him, I'd have died in the storm. He gave me shelter, warmth, and hope. Men like that don't murder for cruelty." Ward was silent for a long moment, his weathered eyes studying her face. Then he turned to Ethan. She telling the truth. Cole Ethan didn't answer at once. He looked at Clara, the woman who had somehow stepped into his exile and turned it into something living. His eyes softened with gratitude and fear. Finally, he said quietly, "I won't deny what I did. But she's right, I'm not that man anymore." The sheriff hesitated. His gaze swept the clearing, the wooden walls still fresh, the small patch of tilled soil, and above the porch carved deep into the beam, a single word, home. Light pierced the mist and struck the word, making it glow as if gilded by grace itself. Ward's expression shifted, uncertain, almost moved. "You carved that yourself?" Ethan nodded. "Yes, I never found justice, Ward, but I found a reason to live." Ward looked again at Clara, still standing firm between them, her breath quick, her eyes bright with defiance. After a long silence, he sighed and slipped the warrant back into his coat. "I was a soldier once too," he said quietly. "I know what war does and what mistakes cost. I can't erase a crime, Cole, but sometimes God forgives where men can't." Ethan lowered his head. "If you need me to go, I'll go. Just let her stay. She shouldn't pay for my past." Ward shook his head slowly. "No, I think she's your future, Cole." The air went still. The scent of pine and thawing snow drifted between them. Clara began to cry, not from fear this time, but from relief. The sheriff stepped forward, resting a weathered hand on Ethan's shoulder. "I'll tell them I never found you, but don't make me regret it. No more ghosts, you hear?" Ethan nodded, his eyes glistening in the soft morning light. "You won't, Sheriff. I stopped running a long time ago." Ward mounted his horse again. Before he left, he looked back one last time. The sunrise broke through the fog, lighting the word home where Ethan and Clara stood side by side. Their shadows stretched long across the melting snow. The sheriff smiled faintly. "Keep this house, Cole. Looks like it needs you more than the law does." Then he turned his horse and rode off into the mist. The sound of hooves faded until only the forest remained. Clara turned to Ethan, her cheeks streaked with tears, the morning glow touching her face. "You were really going to go with him?" He gave a quiet, rueful smile. "I thought I had to pay for what I'd done, but maybe I already have with 7 years of silence." Clara stepped closer, placing her hand over his heart, strong, beating alive. "Then live now, Ethan. For the present." He clasped her hand, his eyes warm and clear. Outside, the sun climbed higher, spilling light over the cabin and the carved word above them, home. And in that golden light, the past finally seemed to dissolve, leaving behind only 2 people, one small house, and a quiet promise that every wound can be forgiven if one has the courage to stay. Part 8. The Farewell. That evening, the wind fell silent, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. The sun sank slowly behind the Madison Range, tinting the sky in deep orange and violet hues that spilled across the melting snow like silk ribbons. Spring was near, yet the air carried a strange heaviness, the still aching quiet of goodbye. Ethan Cole stood on the porch, eyes fixed on the narrow path winding down into the valley. At his side rested a small weathered satchel, enough for a few necessities. In his hand, he held a small leather pouch, its edges frayed, its seams worn by time. Clara Jameson stepped out wrapped in a pale brown shawl. Her heart sank at the sight of him as if she already knew what was coming. "You're leaving," she whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan turned toward her, his eyes soft, touched with the same melancholy glow as the sunset behind him. "Yes. Sheriff Ward gave me a chance, but I can't spend the rest of my life hiding. I need to go to the nearest town, tell the truth at least once before I die." Clara said nothing. A breeze stirred, lifting a few strands of her hair. She didn't plead, only looked into his eyes that were no longer cold, but warm and alive. Ethan opened the small pouch and held it out to her. Inside lay an old silver pocket watch tarnished by age and a thin gold wedding ring, its engraving faded but still faintly visible for Lydia. "These," he said quietly, voice rough with emotion, "are all I have left of them. My wife, my daughter. I carried them like a burden because I couldn't let go. But now, I want to leave them here in this place, with you, where I learned that people can still begin again." Clara reached out her hands, trembling as they brushed against his. His palms were rough and cold, but steady solid like the man he had become. "I don't know if I deserve them," she whispered. Ethan shook his head gently. "You don't need to. Just keep them as proof that I existed. Not as a wanted man, but as someone who learned to love again." Tears welled in Clara's eyes. "You don't have to go. The sheriff let you go. You're free. Stay here, Ethan. We can live quietly. We can be safe." Ethan stepped closer, his gaze deep and calm, like a stream in early spring. He tilted her chin up with his hand, then leaned forward until their foreheads touched. Their eyes closed. Their breaths mingled with the faint scent of pine and smoke. "Clara," he murmured, "if there's a road back, I'll find it." The words were soft, almost carried away by the wind, yet they held the weight of a lifetime seeking redemption. Clara opened her eyes, tears glistening, but her voice was steady now. For the first time since the storm, she wasn't afraid of losing him, because she finally understood some people can leave and still never truly be gone. Ethan pulled back, turned, and started down the path. The wind stirred again, scattering fine dust of melting snow into the air. Each step he took left a dark imprint in the thawing ground, a trail that led back into the wilderness. Clara stood watching him, her hand clutching the leather pouch tightly against her chest. She wanted to call his name, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she whispered softly, "You'll find your way home. I know you will." The last rays of sunlight struck the cabin, gleaming across the carved beam above the porch, the word "home" glowing like a heartbeat against the gold of dusk. Clara walked inside, setting the leather pouch gently on the table beside 2 coffee mugs, still faintly warm. She opened the window, letting the spring wind drift through, carrying the sense of pine wood smoke and something new continuance. From the doorway she watched as Ethan's figure grew smaller, swallowed by the forest until he was gone. An emptiness bloomed in her chest, but it wasn't pain. It was peace, the quiet ache of someone who believes. She sat by the hearth, placing the watch and ring side by side. Her voice was soft, almost a prayer. "Now, Lydia, you can rest. He's been forgiven." The fire crackled brighter, casting a golden glow over her face, no longer shadowed by grief, but illuminated by a quiet strength, by the kind of love that knows how to let go. Outside, the spring wind swept over the cabin, brushing against the wooden sign that bore the word "home." It creaked softly like a promise whispered through time, a vow between a man who had left and a woman who waited beneath the roof they built together. And somewhere far in the mist-covered forest, a lone rider paused and looked back. The sunset touched his face, lighting his brown eyes with warmth. He smiled faintly, touched his chest, where the memory of that carved word lived, and then rode on. Back at the cabin on the porch, bathed in fading light, Clara Jameson stood still, her hand resting over her heart. No more fear, no more loneliness, only faith that love, no matter how far it travels, always finds its way home. Part 9. The Trial of Truth. Night fell over the small town at the foot of the mountains. The moon hid behind a veil of clouds, and only the dim amber light of oil lamps spilled through the courthouse windows. Outside, the wind howled down the empty street carrying the dry chill of the desert, the scent of dust distance, and the unforgiving west. Inside the wooden courtroom was quiet except for the shuffle of boots, the crackle of paper, and the faint whistle of air seeping through the cracks. Ethan Cole sat in the front row. His wrists were bare, unchained, because Sheriff Ward had said his crime isn't that of a runaway. It's the burden of a man who's carried his past too long. Before him, the flame in the judge's oil lamp flickered its light, fragile and uncertain. Around the room, a handful of townsfolk stood in silence. They didn't whisper, didn't judge. They simply watched, trying to decide whether the man before them was a murderer or a soul trying to make peace with himself. The heavy door creaked open. A gust of cold wind swept in, dimming the lamp. Every head turned. Clara Jameson stepped inside. Her dress was plain brown, her hair tied back, her gaze steady, but deep the calm of someone who had already made her choice. Ethan's hands clenched on his knees. His eyes trembled just once. Sheriff Ward rose, his voice even but gentle. "Mrs. Jameson, are you willing to testify for the accused Ethan Cole I am?" Clara replied, her voice firm, though it wavered ever so slightly. She walked to the stand. The golden light from the lamp fell across her face, pale and luminous. Every eye in the room fixed on her, the only woman brave enough to stand for a man whose name had hung on wanted posters across the frontier. The judge nodded. "Tell us what you know." Clara took a deep breath. Her eyes found Ethan, the man sitting silent, head bowed as if afraid to meet the world's gaze. Then, with a trembling but resolute voice, she began, "I met him in a snowstorm out in the Montana wilderness. My wagon had overturned. I was freezing, half-conscious. He, a stranger, found me. He carried me to his cabin, gave me his only blanket and half of his last piece of bread." Her voice broke slightly. "He built a roof over my head. He planted seeds by the porch. He taught me to start a fire and to believe again that kindness still exists. I thought he was cold, but he wasn't. He just carried a wound, the kind that never heals the death of his wife and little girl." The room was utterly still. The wind hissed against the door. The lamp popped softly, and then all was silent again. When I asked him why he would save a stranger, she continued, he said, "Because once I couldn't save the ones I loved." A soft murmur rippled through the crowd. Somewhere in the back, someone exhaled heavily like a sigh of understanding. Clara looked straight at the judge, her eyes shining. "They say he's a killer, but I've lived beside him long enough to know the truth. Ethan Cole didn't kill to survive, he lived to save." The words rang through the courtroom like a church bell, quiet, clear, and absolute. The judge said nothing. No one did. Even the wind outside seemed to pause. Then Clara spoke again, her tone low but filled with unshakable conviction. "If he's guilty of anything, it's of believing that death could atone for a mistake. But he's wrong. He redeemed himself the moment he pulled me from that snow. I am the proof that he's already paid his debt." Ethan lifted his head. His eyes glistened in the dim light, a storm of emotion threatening to break. He wanted to speak, but the words caught in his throat. Sheriff Ward stepped forward at last. For a moment, the old man said nothing. Then, with a slow motion, he removed his hat and placed it gently on the table before the judge. The gesture alone filled the room with silence. "I've spent my life chasing men," he said. "Thieves, killers, deserters, all of them running from something. But this man," he looked at Ethan, "this man isn't one of them. I don't see a criminal tonight. I see a man who's already served his sentence with 7 years of his own silence." The judge's gaze met the sheriff's. "You have nothing more to add, Sheriff Ward?" Only this, Ward said quietly. "Sometimes justice isn't written on paper. It's written on a man's heart." Silence again. The air in the room seemed to soften. The judge set his pen down, his voice solemn but kind. Ethan Cole. If guilt remains in you, time and truth have already erased its shadow. I hereby declare you free. No warrant will bear your name again. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then a single clap, soft, hesitant, and then another, and another, until the entire room was filled with the gentle rhythm of hands, not applause for triumph, but for mercy. Ethan rose slowly. His shoulders trembled as he turned toward Clara, who was watching him through tears. He reached out, took her hand, the same hand that had once trembled beside his in the snow. She smiled through her tears. "I told you," she whispered. "You'd find your way back." Sheriff Ward put his hat back on a faint grin beneath his weathered mustache. Looks like justice finally learned who to trust. The oil lamp flared once, casting a warm glow over the three of them, a fugitive no more, a woman who believed, and a lawman who understood that truth doesn't always need blood to prove itself. Outside, the wind eased. The first light of dawn began to touch the windows. Somewhere down the street, a church bell began to toll, slow, steady, like a new beginning. Ethan turned to Clara, his voice low, steady, and full of peace. "I'm home." She smiled, tears catching the morning light. And for the first time in 7 long years, Montana welcomed back a man once forgotten, no longer hunted, but finally free, carrying not guilt, but the truth. Part 10. Return Home. Spring had finally descended upon the Madison Range after what felt like an endless winter. The snow had melted, revealing soft, damp soil and the fresh scent of pine sap. A gentle morning breeze carried the warmth of new life. Birds sang deep within the forest, their songs echoing like a promise of renewal over a land once buried under storms and shadow. In front of the small wooden cabin by the edge of the woods, Clara Jameson watered the rows of seeds she and Ethan Cole had planted together. Tiny green shoots had begun to emerge, fragile yet brave, stretching toward the light. Clara bent down, touched one of the sprouts gently, and smiled. She wore a simple beige dress, her hair tied neatly at the nape of her neck, a few loose strands dancing in the wind. The early sunlight fell softly on her face, no longer the face of a lost widow, but that of a woman who had rediscovered her faith in life. Above her, carved deep into the wooden beam of the porch, the word "home" remained darker now with time, but strong as ever. Every time she looked at it, her heart warmed, and she could almost hear his voice whispering from somewhere far away. "If there's a road back, I'll find it." Clara lifted her gaze toward the base of the hill. The sky was impossibly clear. Melted snow trickled down the slopes in thin silver streams. Everything was so peaceful that she almost forgot she was still waiting, or rather hoping. Then from a distance came the faint sound of hooves, slow, steady, rhythmic. At first it was only a whisper carried by the wind, but soon it grew stronger, closer. Clara froze, her heartbeat quickening. She set the watering can down, hands tightening instinctively. Through the soft morning mist, a silhouette on horseback emerged. That posture, those broad shoulders, the coat flaring slightly with every gust of wind, unmistakable. The sunlight caught his figure, blurring and sharpening it with each stride. Clara stood still. Her breath trembled. Tears welled in her eyes before she even realized it. The horse stopped before the wooden gate. Ethan Cole dismounted, his boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. He looked around, then smiled, a slow, gentle smile, warm as spring itself. Time hadn't erased the strength in him, but it had softened his face. The weight of his past was gone. What remained was peace, the calm of a man who had finally found where he belonged. Clara took a step forward, then another, and another, until only a breath separated them. "Ethan," she whispered, voice trembling. He nodded, eyes shining with quiet tenderness. "I told you I would." A soft spring breeze swept past them, fluttering the curtain by the cabin window. The small sprouts around their feet swayed gently as if greeting the miracle that had returned. Ethan took one more step closer. His rough, calloused hand found hers. She grasped it firmly without a word. There was no need for language anymore. They stood there beneath the first light of spring, bathed in the golden rays filtering through the pines, glowing against the beam that bore the word home. Ethan lowered his forehead to hers just as he had on the day they said goodbye. But this time, there were no promises left to make because the promise had been kept. Clara smiled through her tears, one rolling down her cheek and falling onto his hand. "You really came back," Ethan answered with a quiet smile, the kind she knew she would remember for the rest of her life. "I only left to find my way, and every road led me here." The wind sighed softly across the cabin roof, brushing over the carved letters of home. Morning sunlight scattered across the ground, painting the scene in gold, two figures standing hand in hand in the stillness of peace. No more snow, no more storms, no more darkness, only light and two hearts that had finally found their home. As the sun rose higher, the spring wind carried the faint scent of wildflowers from the forest, drifting around the cabin. The door stood open. Inside, the fire still burned warmly in the hearth. On the table beside two steaming cups of coffee lay the old leather pouch, the one that once held a pocket watch and a wedding ring, now resting beside a small, freshly picked flower. Final scene. Ethan and Clara stood on the porch, hands entwined, gazing over the sunlit valley. They said nothing. They didn't need to. In their eyes was only one truth: we're home. Evening descended slowly over the Madison Range. The last light of day streamed through the pines, coating the cabin roof in honey gold. A soft breeze stirred the curtain by the window. Thin trails of smoke rose from the chimney, dissolving into the golden sky. On the porch, Ethan Cole and Clara Jameson sat side by side. Between them, 2 cups of coffee steamed gently. Beside them, the old leather pouch, now part of the home they had built together. They watched the sun sink behind the mountains. The golden light lingered on the carved beam above them, illuminating the word home. It glowed as if chiseled from sunlight, itself a symbol of hope, redemption, and the quiet mercy that had saved 2 lonely souls. In the harsh lands of the West, where the wind can steal a man's breath, only kindness and love can keep a heart warm. The spring wind stirred once more, making the wooden sign tremble softly. From the forest came the call of birds returning home. The camera lingered on the word home, no longer just a name for a place, but a symbol of the belief that even in the wildest frontier, the human spirit can still find redemption. The light dimmed. The guitar faded into slow, tender notes, each strum like a heartbeat. Ethan turned to Clara. She leaned her head gently on his shoulder and smiled. A peaceful breath, a quiet smile. If this story touched your heart, share it so the fire of kindness keeps burning across the Wild West. Subscribe for more tales where love finds a home, even in the harshest lands. In the unforgiving West, love and kindness are the only shelter. The cowboy, strong, silent, and gentle, is its soul. Every story is a spark of fire, small but enough to warm the wild.